When Malcolm Harper, a black delivery courier, was accused of theft on a wealthy homeowner's doorstep, the accusation quickly escalated into a police call, drawing neighbors' judgmental stares. As tensions rose and a single surveillance camera held the truth, what happened next would shatter lives and expose a harsh reality. But let's start at the beginning. Malcolm Harper pulled his delivery van into the wide driveway of an immaculate suburban home. The house was massive, its pristine white walls gleaming under the late afternoon sun. Perfectly trimmed hedges lined the front yard, and a water fountain gurgled softly near the front steps. It was the kind of neighborhood where every house seemed to demand respect, a silent reminder of wealth and exclusivity. Malcolm parked neatly, double-checked the package label, and stepped out of the van. He straightened his company-issued uniform, a crisp polo shirt with the delivery service logo and dark cargo pants. His polished demeanor was not just a reflection of professionalism, but also an unspoken understanding of the stereotypes he often faced. As a young black man working in predominantly white neighborhoods, he knew the assumptions people could make. His smile was practiced but sincere, a way to disarm any prejudice before it could form. Holding the small package securely, he walked briskly toward the grand oak door, its brass knocker gleaming in the sunlight. He pressed the doorbell and waited. The seconds stretched uncomfortably as no immediate answer came. Malcolm shifted slightly on the porch, glancing back at his van to ensure everything was in order. Just as he was about to ring again, the door opened sharply, revealing Steve Carson. Steve was in his late 40s, his appearance polished but uninviting. He wore an expensive button-down shirt tucked into slacks, his posture stiff and his expression one of irritation. "You're late," Steve barked, not even glancing at the package Malcolm held out. His eyes scanned Malcolm from head to toe, lingering just a beat too long, as if assessing him. Malcolm maintained his professionalism. "Apologies for the delay, sir. Here's your package," he said, extending it with a polite smile. Steve snatched the package, but didn't move aside to let Malcolm leave. Instead, his eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a frown. "Wait a second," he snapped. "Where's the other one?" Caught off guard, Malcolm blinked. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is the only package I have for you," he explained, quickly pulling up his delivery app to show Steve the single entry. "There's nothing else listed for your address?" Steve's brows furrowed, and his face darkened. "Don't lie to me," he growled, his voice rising. "I saw you standing by your truck for a while before you came up here. What were you doing? Hiding it?" "Excuse me?" Malcolm asked, his voice still calm but with a tinge of disbelief. The accusation stung, but he held his composure. "Sir, I wasn't hiding anything. I was just checking the address to make sure it was correct." But Steve wasn't interested in explanations. "I said you stole it!" he roared, stepping closer and pointing an accusatory finger at Malcolm. The confrontation was loud enough to draw the attention of nearby neighbors, curtains twitching as people peeked out to see the commotion. Malcolm felt the weight of their gazes, his heart pounding. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, Steve had already whipped out his phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report a theft," Steve said into the phone, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "A delivery guy just stole from my property." Malcolm froze on the porch, his mind racing. He wanted to leave, to get back in his van and drive away, but he knew that would only make things worse. Instead, he stayed put, standing rigidly with his hands at his sides, his breath shallow as he waited for the police. Minutes later, 2 patrol cars pulled up, their red and blue lights flashing. The scene seemed to freeze in time. Neighbors began stepping out onto their lawns, their curiosity palpable. Malcolm felt his pulse race as 2 officers exited their vehicles and approached him. One officer, a tall man with a commanding presence, gestured for Malcolm to step forward. "ID, please," the officer said firmly, his tone leaving no room for refusal. Malcolm fished out his wallet with steady hands, presenting his identification while trying to remain calm. He knew better than to make sudden movements. The second officer turned to Steve, who launched into an animated retelling of his version of events. "I saw him by his truck before he came up here," Steve said. "He was fidgeting with something. There should have been 2 packages, but he only brought 1. Malcolm opened his mouth to defend himself, but the first officer held up a hand. "We'll get to you in a moment," he said curtly. The officer's tone wasn't hostile, but the implicit authority made Malcolm's stomach churn. As the officers continued questioning, Malcolm felt the weight of every eye in the neighborhood on him. He stood straight, refusing to let his fear show, but inside, he couldn't help but wonder how this would end. Malcolm stood stiffly on the porch, his hands clasped in front of him as he recounted his version of events to the officers. His voice was steady, but there was a noticeable tension in his tone. "I delivered the one package assigned to this address. It's all I've got in my scanner," he explained, holding out the device for the officers to see. Before either officer could examine it, Steve cut him off, his voice sharp and accusatory. "He's lying!" Steve snapped. "I saw him lingering by his truck before he came up. He must have pocketed something. Why else would he take so long?" One of the officers turned to Steve, his brow furrowed. "Sir, let him finish," he said, his voice firm but calm. But Steve didn't back down, his face red with indignation. Malcolm took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to keep his frustration from showing. He knew how this looked. A black man accused in an affluent, predominantly white neighborhood. Every moment of this encounter felt like walking a tightrope. As Malcolm continued to explain, he noticed the growing crowd of neighbors gathering at their windows and front lawns. Some whispered to each other, their eyes darting back and forth between him and the officers. Others crossed their arms, their faces a mix of concern and skepticism. Clara Simmons, an older woman who had lived on the street for decades, finally stepped forward. Her silver hair was pulled back into a bun, and her floral print dress swayed slightly in the breeze as she approached the officers. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but resolute. The officers turned toward her, curious. "I've seen him around here for months," Clara continued, gesturing toward Malcolm. "He delivers here all the time, and he's always been polite and professional. I've never seen or heard anything to suggest he'd do something like this. Are you sure this isn't just a misunderstanding?" Steve rounded on her, his expression furious. "Clara, you don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. "You don't see what I see. This guy's been scoping out the neighborhood for weeks. I've been watching him." Malcolm's chest tightened, and he clenched his hands behind his back to keep his composure. The weight of the accusation, combined with the murmurs of the growing crowd, felt suffocating. Emily, Steve's teenage daughter, suddenly appeared in the doorway, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. "Dad!" she called, her voice cracking with frustration. "Why are you doing this?" Steve turned to her, startled. "Emily, go back inside," he said sternly, his tone leaving little room for argument. But Emily wasn't deterred. She stepped onto the porch, her gaze flicking between Malcolm, the officers, and the crowd. "We've had delivery issues before. You know that. It's the system, not him," she shouted, her voice trembling. "You can't just accuse someone like this. It's wrong." Steve's jaw tightened, and his face grew even redder. "Emily, this doesn't concern you," he snapped. "Yes, it does," she shot back. "You're embarrassing yourself. And me." The officers exchanged a glance before one of them stepped forward. "Sir," he said to Steve, "do you have security cameras? Reviewing the footage could help clear this up quickly." Steve hesitated, his expression shifting from outrage to discomfort. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest. I do, but that won't show anything. He probably hid whatever he took before he even got to the door." The second officer raised an eyebrow. "If there's nothing to hide, the cameras should confirm that. Would you allow us to take a look?" Steve opened his mouth to protest but stopped when he noticed the crowd of neighbors watching intently. With a huff, he relented. "Fine," he muttered, "but you'll see I'm right." As Steve led the officers inside, Clara gave Malcolm a reassuring smile. "Stay strong," she said gently. Malcolm nodded, but his heart was pounding. The whispers continued, and the weight of judgment bore down on him. All he could do now was wait, and hope the truth would speak for itself. The officers and Steve reviewed the surveillance footage, while Malcolm stood outside, trying to keep his composure. Clara stayed nearby, offering quiet words of support. Inside, the footage told a different story. It showed Malcolm arriving with one package, walking to the door, and handing it over without hesitation. There was no second package, no theft, just a hard-working man doing his job. When the officer pointed this out, Steve grew defensive. "Maybe he hid it in his truck before coming to the door," he insisted. Another officer sighed. "Sir, the footage clearly shows no wrongdoing. It's time to let this man go." Steve's face turned red as Emily stormed in. "You're wrong, Dad. You need to apologize to him." Reluctantly, Steve stepped outside to face Malcolm, but instead of apologizing, he muttered, "Next time, don't look so suspicious." The officers didn't let the matter end there. Seeing how baseless the accusation was, they issued Steve a citation for filing a false police report, explaining that his actions had wasted valuable police resources. News of the incident spread quickly. Emily, disgusted by her father's behavior, posted the surveillance footage online, where it gained traction. The video sparked outrage, with people from all over condemning Steve's actions and praising Malcolm's calm under pressure. Malcolm's employer publicly supported him, issuing a statement about the importance of treating delivery workers with respect. Clara and other neighbors rallied around Malcolm, organizing a small neighborhood event to thank him for his work and show solidarity. Though shaken, Malcolm found strength in the support he received. For Steve, the incident became a harsh lesson in accountability, one his community would not let him forget.